Hey y'all, Zelda here. I am coming to you today to talk a little bit about why mindfulness spaces need to be more trauma informed or need to be trauma informed at all. And by mindfulness, I'm really thinking about spaces that are not therapy but therapeutic in nature. They deal with internal, psychological, spiritual processes. With mindfulness specifically, I'm talking not just about like attentional regulation, but like trance journeys that are healing. And I see this a lot in the spiritual space and I actually even see it in the therapeutic space, that sometimes dropping people into mindfulness is not a trauma-informed process and can actually be very counterproductive for the people who are experiencing it. And in order to illustrate this, I'm going to talk about some of my experiences both as a provider and also as a participant, someone who did a lot of mindfulness. Like, some background on me is that before I became a therapist, before I went to school to be a therapist and to get licensed, I was a yoga instructor, which, like, shocker. I feel like that was a hugely common thing for someone to do at the time period I went. There were a lot of like yoga instructor trainings. And I went through that process and did that and just noticed a lot of mindfulness, like meditation, yoga, other types of spiritual spaces were not really trauma informed in how different people can experience those practices if they come from trauma. And so I am someone who I'm quite open about being a lived experience provider. I have C-PTSD, which is complex PTSD, which is like multi different points, but also very specific points in my life. I am also autistic and have AuDHD. And those are the primary things that I kind of talk about and relate to other people and work with people around, as well as like anxiety. But I'm not going to get too much into those. And I guess I share those things because a lot of the things that I'm going to share about are about my personal experience, which will obviously be based on my neurotype, my lived experience before that. But I have had experiences that are very trauma informed, and I have also had experiences that I feel like caused a lot of rupture internally and made it a lot more difficult for me to engage in practices that otherwise would have been very helpful for me. And this isn't to blame anyone. Like, I think being trauma informed is something that I kind of think all spaces should be. Like, being aware of the fact that people come with different experiences that allow them different access to different tools, to me feels very like, I think any like wellness or health or mindfulness or a spiritual space ideally would come with the assumption that different people are coming from different backgrounds and might need different things. Just kind of like if you're teaching a fitness class, you want to have modifications so that different bodies with different backgrounds can safely access that. And so that to me is not like to shame the things that people are doing because they didn't know or because that was like less the part of the like collective vernacular. As we live and learn, we can also modify our behavior. And that's not to also like make it okay if anyone has experienced harm. Like, that's just to also validate and acknowledge that. So I'm going to tell some of the stories that I've experienced of why mindfulness was really hard. And the earliest experience of mindfulness that I had was my mom would take me to these yoga classes when I was younger because I was very anxious, and it was one of the things she was trying to do to help. And I was pretty young. I was like 10 years old, and the teachers were so kid friendly, and I would get so anxious and restless, especially during Shavasana, which is like the resting pose at the end. And it felt so agitating to me. And they would always give me like things to do. They would like come over and whisper and give me like an activity for me to do during that time. And that is one of the first things that I recognize as being like very accessible for how to relate to that, is like having modifications. But after that, the next kind of mindfulness that was really poignant, I would say. And this is after I had experienced a lot more trauma, actually. And so it was when I was 19 or 18, 19, I guess. I was 19 and I was living in Wisconsin. I went through my yoga teacher training, and there was a person who was at the yoga studio that I was working at and learning at, and they did this guided meditation that was like a healing trance journey. And in this trance, you were supposed to, visualize going to this fountain and like washing off the things of your body that like a cleansing practice, essentially. Like you would imagine yourself, like whatever the fountain looked like, kind of washing over you. Kind of a basic guided meditation. And this is not to like say, oh, that it was basic. It was like more like, I don't think that person was doing anything inordinately harmful, but they didn't mention anything of like a variety of experiences. And so I had this really intense visceral experience of trying to like wash myself and not being able to like get it clean, of just feeling like really dirty and yucky as I was doing this process, and that it was like never going to be enough. And I like started crying. I had to leave the room. It wasn't like I was able to do it quietly because I was embarrassed. I was a high masking individual, and I was embarrassed. I came back and I listened to everyone else share their experience in the end. And it was a profoundly positive experience for a lot of people. It was very like nurturing and supportive and cleansing. And of course, right, like that, I think in many ways was the desired outcome of the facilitator, was to support a cleansing practice that felt effective and nourishing for people. So I didn't share during the sharing time because I was really overwhelmed. And then I went up and talked to the person at the end, and they honestly didn't really know what to say. That's what I think happened, because I shared and they were like, well, you could just try doing it more often. It's fine. Like they kind of said that, but there was just like a look that I didn't really understand on their face. But I think that they kind of knew that that was out of the depths, but they didn't say anything. And this then would come up later. I feel like at that point, I knew that I had experienced trauma, but I just wanted to move on. I hadn't really attended to it. I hadn't been to therapy. I just wanted to move on, which is not an uncommon, if people can, it's not an uncommon way to try and cope with trauma, is to just like compartmentalize it and try to move forward, which is why I think sometimes people can't like self-screen themselves out of these different situations. Like it's not enough of being trauma informed to say, hey, if you have unresolved trauma, just don't come to this, because people don't want to identify as having unresolved trauma if they're just trying to move on with their lives. And it's not fair. Like there's no right or wrong way to cope and heal after trauma. I don't think that is, I think that's a collective rather than an individual challenge that we face, is like, where do people go to heal? How do we hold healing process, knowing that it is not that uncommon to experience trauma in our world? So that was one experience. And I don't think that was very trauma informed. This is not to like poo-poo the person who facilitated, like I said. But then to contrast that, I came to Naropa for my undergrad. I went to my undergrad and graduate at Naropa University in Boulder. And in the undergrad, there's like a lot of mindfulness requirements, particularly because I was in the contemplative psychology, like somatic specific major track. And there were mindfulness classes. So one of the mindfulness classes was just like a meditation class. It was very intro. It was like very early in my academic career. I was a big like dork about school. I like really wanted to get good grades. I wanted to do things well. And if you know anything or you've been in Naropa, it's like a more casual academic environment. Like, not that it can't be rigorous, and it is when you get up in majors, and it definitely is in graduate school. Very different from undergrad, but it is a lot more like mellow and experiential, I would say, as far as a university setting goes. And so in this mindfulness class, there was a lot of like intro, like first level students, people who had never done mindfulness. And we were just sitting, right? We were practicing like a Buddhist contemplative practice where you notice your attention and you notice when it drifts and you bring your attention back. And it's a pretty basic, like attentional mindfulness approach, I would say. And every time I would sit down on the cushion to do this, because we would sit at the beginning of class for like 30 minutes, and the classes were 3 hours long, which is normal at Naropa. And we would sit for the first 30 minutes, and other people would constantly bring up the challenge of falling asleep. And I would just be so anxious. I would be anxious. I would have flashbacks essentially. And I would share about being anxious. And the teachers were very welcoming of sharing this diverse experience. Partly it was a contemplative psychology, right? So there's already this more trauma-informed lens. But I would like go and talk to my teacher, like, I don't know what I'm doing wrong. And there was this very gentle, like, nudging of like, maybe try, instead of doing for your homework, like we had to sit a certain amount of times for our homework. Essentially, we did like keep a meditation journal, and I would essentially just sit down and have panic attacks. Like as soon as I didn't have outside stimulation, I would just panic, and I was overwhelmed. I didn't know how to cope with my experience. And the teachers were very like giving me a lot of alternatives. They were like, do walking meditation for when you're doing your mindfulness practice, and do something outside, and maybe listen to some music or do something in a mindful way. And they were like not saying, but like there was a tone of like, I don't even know if he said it, the teacher was really nice, very like Mr. Rogers type of vibe. And he, I think very gently one time said, it's not uncommon for people who have experienced unsafety in their bodies to have a really hard time. Like, I think he said it that way. And I was like, oh yeah, okay. And I don't know that I really integrated it, which I think is also part of being trauma informed, is not being like, you shouldn't be in this space because something is concerning, but is like almost knowing the signs of like when that might be something that is coming up for people. And I think that's hard because a lot of these online mindfulness experiences are like big seminars, are big things that you can download or watch on YouTube, which I think it's so amazing too, that so many resources are available online and are accessible in this way. Like that's such an awesome thing. But there's not a lot of talk about like what happens if someone has a negative coded reaction to one of these experiences. Like, how do you support them? Do you support them? What could come up, right? And that's, I think, a big part of why it seems so important to me to like think about what kind of ways can you support someone. So those are some of the initial modifications. The third one that I'm going to mention is that I did this more upper level class at Naropa, still in my undergrad, called Maitri. And there are these Maitri rooms, and they're all different colors. And you go and you are in the specific position in this room that is this color, and you have this experience, and you do it several times throughout. I think we had to do it like 5 times, and log our experience. And it was really intense. I really liked it. I was like very into writing, like poetry in these rooms and like doing my writing projects. It was very like almost like psychologically immersive for me. I loved it. I was very into that. And the last room was called the Buddha room, I believe. It was all white. And excuse me if I'm remembering this wrong. It was a long time ago now that I was an undergrad. But you have to be in this position where you have your hands like this and are like on your knees, basically like on your elbows and your knees facing the wall, like the whole room is behind you. And I had such a horrible time. I like had a panic attack the first time. I could not be in this position in this room. And I went and I talked to the teacher because every time I thought about going back, and they were like, you can write your reflection about this experience. You don't need to share about this in class. You can if you want, but you don't need to. You can go and do this position in your room. You can imagine being in there, or you can fulfill this in a different way and just talk about not feeling ready to engage with this and like what comes up for you. And they waived all the other parts of the assignment and had me do this. They like created a whole new assignment for me, essentially, to be able to not go into this because they recognized that, one, they couldn't go with me every day. They're a professor that had tons of other classes and requirements, which is so valid, right? Like part of being trauma informed is knowing what you can and cannot provide and how to support and scaffold the person given those limitations and potential, right? And so they were very able to give me an alternative. And I think that's a big part of this process. So what are the other kind of, I guess, okay, one other example I want to give that is an example of how I have seen it be challenging for people to access because of different types of trauma is that in EMDR, when they do like grounding meditations, this is a very common grounding meditation. And I used to do it when I would facilitate a motivational interviewing training, which I do trainings for people who are going to like utilize that tool with clients. That one of the things that we do is have people imagine like a nurturing or a supportive mentoring figure. Could be a parent, could be a guardian, could be someone else in your life. But it also, I am very cautious to open this to include, it could be an animal, it could be a like spiritual figure, like an angel, it could be a fictional like being, someone who you read about and think is an amazing character that would support you. When I say like spiritual, it could be an angel. It could be like, if you're very religious, it could be Mother Mary. Like these are things that I think people can connect to. And one of the reasons that I do this is because regularly what comes up for people, and not necessarily more often than not, but I would say a significant amount that I would always include it, is acknowledging that sometimes people cannot think of a supportive figure in their life. And the grief that comes up is very overwhelming, because that is not the intention of an activity like that, right? The intention of an activity like that is to connect to something nurturing and supportive that can be grounding and stabilizing, not to rub one's face or be in direct contact with the wound of what we have had a lack of, what we have experienced neglect around. Not that that is not appropriate content if you are working with a therapist or working actively even with this on your own, like doing journaling, sitting with yourself, have support, or like talking to a friend about this. Like, your grief is not the problem. It is the fact that not recognizing that these can be difficult experiences set someone up to feel further isolated, to feel broken, to feel like there is no space for them in that kind of environment, because it isn't acknowledged that their experience is totally valid. So in addition to doing that, I also acknowledge that it is okay for this practice not to just elicit positive feelings, right? And when I do it one-on-one with people, I talk through in advance what they want to imagine and visualize a little bit, and then walk them in and allow them to have that, so that they don't have the feeling of like coming up short. And I think that can also be a very useful thing, not just trauma-informed, but also neurodivergent-informed, is that sometimes imagining things can feel really open-ended and difficult to grasp onto. And sometimes preparing and talking about what it's going to look like in advance allows someone to just relax. That also can be trauma-informed, because in trauma-informed healthcare, I think of a lot of times like telling someone what you're going to do before you're doing it is a big part of what allows someone the ability to say no, to request something different, to inform if that's going to be challenging, and just respect someone's bodily autonomy and need to like not be surprised and triggered by anything that is going on in their environment, if possible to avoid. So that's an example of how that comes up in EMDR a lot. I would say that I see it like people have challenges with, or in any other like environment where it's like, oh, just come up with this positive thing. Like, the things that I would say are the tips. I'm going to move into that portion. Sorry that this is, as all of my videos, it's like I am not a linear thinker. I'm like circuitous and tangential, and that's just part of the deal, unless I somehow become amazing at video editing and figure out how to fix that, which, don't hold your breath. So the tips that I jotted down that I just wanted to share, so before I share the tips, I just want to name that it is a lot of work to think about modifying this or acknowledging this, or it can be scary, or even like liability wise, it can feel hard to think, oh, like this could be really triggering. Like, don't I just want to like not have people who need that be in this space because I can't support that? I want to name that I have had so much benefit from building a relationship with my internal world, with building a relationship with my body, with building a relationship with my spiritual guides, that I could not have done if I did not move through the discomfort of being in my body and feeling the realities of the traumas that I had experienced. I could not have these other experiences if I didn't move through that, right? Like, if I avoided it, I would also have missed out on all these other things because I couldn't like be alone with myself. myself in that kind of way. And that was such a painful experience that avoiding it was not actually the answer. And I do not shame or blame anyone who is in a space where they want to avoid it. I totally understand that. And it is nobody else's job to give you a timeline for when you do that, if you do that. I just think that it can be very empowering to acknowledge that moving through these experiences can have an incredibly positive outcome afterwards, can be alleviating of a lot of avoidance-oriented trauma symptoms that drive things like anxiety and panic. So some of the tips for being more trauma-informed in mindfulness for me is that basically having an awareness that for many people, the body has been a site of pain and violence and trauma. If you experienced abuse as a young kid, if you experienced sexual violence, if you experienced emotional violence that had to do with your body, if you experienced physical pain that is chronic or ongoing or untreated, any of these things can be very difficult to contend with if you have been living in a dissociated state essentially, and you're trying to like go back in. It can feel very scary. And so knowing that there is not necessarily a sense of safety waiting within the body for people can help, because it allows you to give different points of accessing the mindfulness besides just an embodied approach. It can be a way to know that focusing on the breath, if someone has anxiety, can bring up anxiety, right? Just awareness of the fact that if there is unsafety, there might be things that you want to offer other options for, or acknowledge that you don't need to do certain things if that feels overwhelming, to provide lots of alternatives, that kind of thing. Even just acknowledging that if at any point, I think teachers of classes sometimes do this, is like encouraging people to listen to their experience and follow their needs can go a long way in being more informed, because it gives people the invitation explicitly to not follow your instructions if it is causing them grief, and to reorient to their own well-being. Offering opportunities for titration. So titration, or like oscillating attention, is the idea that instead of just dropping someone in, it could be helpful to touch in and then have a way to be outside of the self. One thing that I always offer for folks, especially like I'm going to use EMDR as an example because I do a lot of guided imagery for folks around EMDR practice, and use a lot of imaginal resourcing. And one of the things that I think is really helpful is being able to like keep your eyes open. So even that simple instruction of you can close your eyes, you can drop in, but if it also helps you stay oriented or feel safe, you can keep your eyes open. It keeps you anchored to the world around you and lets you know that you are not in the past, you are in the present. And if that is helpful for people, doing these things can help them to titrate their own experience and not feel like trapped inside of themselves. Normalizing different kinds of experience. So expressing explicitly that it is not a failure to have a harder or more intense time, that's a very valuable experience, that if grief arose of what lack there was, and explicitly like inviting different types of experience to be present in like a sharing context can be really healing, not forcing it. But I think sometimes one way that I would do it is in a group setting. If someone said, oh, I had a really positive, nourishing experience. The mentor figure was this friend of my child, like of my parents from childhood, and they always were this, and this. And then another person shares an experience like that. One thing I might do as a facilitator is intervene and say, did anyone have a different experience? Like, that's an amazing experience. Did anyone have anything else come up? Just to explicitly insinuate that even if there is a norm or something that did come up, that's not the right experience to have. And I think that is sometimes obvious as a facilitator, that there's no right experience, and you can even say it, but inviting room and making space for alternative experiences or divergent experiences from the norm also helps to normalize that. And also other people can learn from that. I think that is part of how we learn and support each other, is learning from our diverse experiences. Making it okay to be hard and explicitly offering people opportunities to opt out, I think is also important. Offering different types of mindfulness can also be a very trauma-informed approach. This could be walking meditation versus seated, which I expressed explicitly that like my teachers at Naropa were really good at offering me that. Doing something outside. Some of the different categories of mindfulness I think about are like sensory awareness, awareness of the breath, awareness of the body, mindfulness that's imagery based, that's like often related to trance. Sometimes that can be a mix, and any sort of mixture of these. Imagining like a guide feels like a spiritual imaginal space, even if it's not active imagery, like you don't see things, you might feel things. And that's kind of what I mean by active imagery, which I think can be a deceptive term. But being very mindful to the different ways that people experience mindfulness and can have an inroad to it. Also inviting opportunity for people to approach you or have some one-on-one time, obviously within reason. Like if you're going and you're doing a free thing at the library for mindfulness, you might not have time or energy to do one-on-ones with everyone after, but being available to offer someone resources for where they can go if things arise, letting people have at least a little bit of like point of contact time can just be a responsible thing to do if you're opening this up for people. I think it has been really helpful for me to have people in my life who have kind of like guided me in the right direction. Not that anyone is entitled to that or that there's anything wrong with not being able to offer that to every single person. But if you do have the space, sometimes if you notice a mindfulness response that seems trauma informed, even saying things gently like sometimes people who have trauma have an experience like that. That could be something to like look into support, like, or not even saying that last part, just like letting that be, right? And letting that hang can give someone the feeling of like, does that apply to me? How do I feel about that maybe applying to me? That kind of thing. So these are the initial things that I think have come to mind. Maybe I'll have more specific tips, but these are just ways that I think we can start to think more about being trauma-informed in mindful and spiritual spaces. Is there anything that has come up for you, either in not feeling like spaces have been trauma-informed? And I will encourage, like, instead of calling out any of those, I'm just curious about like the practices that have felt less supportive or that have felt really supported and have allowed you to like access that resource in a different way. I would love to know that. I'm always trying to learn more too. So if there are things that I definitely didn't mention, I would love if those were brought into conversation. Yeah, I think that's all for now. I'll see you next time.